Lab 4. We're going to take a look at bird bones. Bones make an interesting lab because these are examples of many of the avian synapomorphies, right? These are attributes of birds that all birds share and are not shared among other organisms outside class Aves. There are a lot of cool specializations for flight and a lot of differences among species related to their particular ecology. So take a look at the skeleton of a bird. The common bones are much the same as your own and should be familiar to you. And you should know the names of most of these. It's pretty straightforward. We're not going to spend time on that in the video right here. You can take a look at this in your handout. It's interesting to note, just take a look here at that skeleton and you see about 8 or 9 synapomorphies right here. The carpometacarpus on the hand there, the ulnar and the radial, the carpal elements have been reduced to those 2 bones. The Synsacrum is a bunch of fused vertebrae, the pygostyle where the tail attaches. You've got fused tibiotarsus and tarsometatarsus at the bottom, a big keel on the sternum, a furcula, which is fused clavicles, a little triosseal canal or hole up through where 3 bones come together. All these things are really cool attributes of bird skeletal structure. When it comes to the skull, there's about 9 or 10 different bones that you should probably recognize, or parts of the skull, like the foramen magnum, the big opening through which the neural canal runs. Again, this isn't that big a deal. You probably know most of these bones are the same as the ones in your own skull, except around the palate and the roof of the mouth. And there's a few unique bones. It's hard to see individual bones in bird skulls, unlike mammals, but you can tell, if it's a frontal, parietal, or occipital based on the region of the skull. It's pretty crude, but if you get the right area, you'll be fine. The unique skull features include things like sclerotic ossicles. These sclerotic ring around the eye in birds can be really pronounced in owls and in some of the falconiforms. This squeezes the eye into sort of an oblong shape and also changes the shape of the cornea, which can help aid the lens in keeping images focused on the retina. That's a weird sort of bone structure in birds. Look to the right there. Birds have the reptilian jaw condition, where the jaw joint occurs between the quadrate bone on the skull and the articular bone on the lower mandible. These bones have become the incus and malleus in the middle ear in mammals, of course. So our dentary articulates directly with our skull, unlike the bird skull. Now, bird skulls are also said to be kinetic. The bone structure in the skull around the quadrate and the palatines and the pterygoids allow the upper and lower mandible to move sort of independently of the rest of the skull and of each other. So when the lower jaw opens, see the lower jaw drops down, it hits a point where the postorbital ligament acts like a rope and forces the bottom of the quadrate to rotate forward. This, in turn, forces the jugal arch or palatine or pterygoid, all those bones, to push forward on the upper mandible, causing it to rotate up a bit at the craniofacial hinge. A skull with a rigid cranium and lower jaw hinged to it like ours is said to be akinetic. It has akinetic jaw movement. But bird skulls and many lizards and snakes have movable joints in the cranium, so their jaws are described as kinetic. Their jaw movement is kinetic. Okay, the hyoid bone is the bone that holds the tongue, supports the tongue and cartilage around the trachea. It's homologous to the second gill arch of jawless fishes. It's found in all vertebrates, although in birds it forms the majority of the tongue as opposed to the muscle, which forms the majority of our tongue. What's weird about the hyoid is in some cases it's extremely long. Look at the woodpecker, for example. Woodpeckers have the whole apparatus wrap all the way around the skull and then end up in the right nostril. The tongue of something the size of a hairy woodpecker can extend more than 2 inches. It's incredible. And so here's a couple of views, and we'll have a little alcohol specimen for you to look at in lab. But here's some pictures of a tongue retracted, and then down the bottom, the tongue protruded, and another picture here where the tongue is protruded a bit. And notice the very tip of the tongue can even be barbed, to help stab insects deep into trees, that kind of thing, larvae, beetle larvae, and things like that. Let's take a look going on down from the head. The vertebrae. Bird vertebrae are said to be heterocoelous. Okay, they have cervical vertebrae that articulate with each other uniquely, compared to acoelous or flat vertebrae. The centrum on our vertebrae, mammal vertebrae, is flat and abuts the flat centrum on the next vertebra in front of it. Bird centrums are saddle-shaped, right? And the saddle on the anterior of one vertebra is at a right angle to the saddle on the posterior end of the next vertebra. This permits an incredible range of motion at each joint, kind of like a U-joint in a car. Extreme head rotation, we think, is necessary for keeping the head steady in flight, so it's probably a flight adaptation as well. Pygostyle. There's a bunch of fused vertebrae down at the tip of the tail. It's a bone unique to birds. It looks like a rudder off the back of the bird, but it's really important for the independent function of the tail from the rest of the bird's body. Half the rectrices come off each side, and they can be fanned independently of each other. So by elevating, depressing, or rotating the pygostyle, the bird has complete control over the entire tail, using muscles that are not connected to the hind limbs as they would be in reptiles and mammals, for example. The carina of the sternum, this big keel, that's a big surface area for muscle attachment. When you eat your chicken or turkey, you can see the attachment of the pectoralis and the supracoracoideus. So the pectoralis muscle, the breast muscle, originates along the carina. The muscle is strong enough that in pigeons it can produce over 30 newtons, about 8 times the bird's body weight. And that's just one side. So imagine being able to bench press about 16 times your body weight. Such a strong muscle must act on strong joints, so the coracoid bone is very bold, strong, supports the shoulder against the sternum so the muscle doesn't kind of dislocate the shoulder. The furcula is cool. It's fused clavicles, right? The wishbone. And what's neat about it, why have that? Why is it fused? It's kind of it acts as a spring and a pump at the same time. This pump and spring mechanism was described by a few people, including Ken Dial. The mechanism is shown here on the right. There's a cross-sectional view of the pectoral girdle looking head-on toward the tail, right? During the downstroke, the wing downstroke, the furcula bends outward to each side, right? And the sternum moves upward. And during the upstroke, the furcula recoils inward like a spring, and the sternum moves downward. So the action of this furcular spring, where you open and it bounces back, it stores energy when it opens and then recovers the energy when it recoils and helps on the upstroke. In combination with the sternal pump, that motion probably helps to move air between the lungs and air sacs as well during flight, supplementing the normal breathing mechanisms. Now, if you look at where the coracoid, scapula, and furcula come together, they form a really important passageway, a little hole called the Foramen triosseum. You'll be able to see this in the lab. The tendon of the upstroke muscle, the supracoracoideus, passes from the bottom or ventral side of the bird, right, where it's attached on the carina, up through this hole onto the upper or dorsal surface of the humerus. That muscle then contracts and it brings the arm up, the upstroke. So the mass of the muscle is ventral, below the bird, at the lower center of gravity, and connects to the large carina, but uses the passageway as a pulley system. So when it shortens, the humerus is elevated. That's pretty cool. Now, Ratites, which came from flying ancestors, have lost some of these unique features associated with flight, mainly the carina. It's a tiny little carina and something like an ostrich compared to a flying bird. There are, of course, hollow bones that we talked about in lecture, with lots of struts to maintain strength, but yet be very light. If you look at the humerus here, it has a little hole in the end that you can see in lab called the pneumatic foramen. And that's a point at which some of the air sac, one of the air sacs goes into, interclavicular air sac goes into the bone there. We'll talk about air sacs in a couple of weeks in lab. The ulna at the bottom there is the site of the attachment of secondary flight feathers, and so you can see little dimples or dips on the bone to know that you're looking at the ulna there. That's right where the ends of the feathers attach. The forelimb of the bird is really cool. The distal part out toward the end shows a heck of a lot of fusion. It's really complicated. In birds, the carpal bones are reduced to two, as I said, the radial and the ulnar. That's all that's left. The metacarpals are fused with some of the carpals there to form what's called the carpometacarpus. And then the manus, which I'll circle here, is the collective term for carpals, carpometacarpus, and phalanges. It's now felt that digits 1, 2, and 3 remain from reptilian ancestors, and only the second digit has more than one bone. The thumb, the pollex, has attached feathers, the alula, which are important, of course, aerodynamically. Look at the ribs. They're jointed, and this is important in avian respiration. As the lungs, as the rib cage basically can collapse a bit and open and collapse a bit. Birds don't have a diaphragm. In order to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, the joint angle is increased and the sternum is lowered. Now, despite the extreme thinness of ribs, the strength is maintained through the presence of these uncinate processes that we talked about in lecture. And these processes are present only in birds and sphenodon and maybe, I think, some crocodiles. Go down to the pelvic girdle. It's highly fused, probably to enable the bird to withstand the shock of landing and the power of takeoff. The ilium is anterior and dorsal, and it's kind of hollowed out, the ilium. The ischium, you sit on the squish. It's the largest element of the girdle. The pubis is a tiny little slender backwardly facing bone. Remember we talked about backward facing pubis? There it is. There's no pubic symphysis where they come together and touch each other in any modern bird except the ostrich. Now the synsacrum is a bunch of fused vertebrae that attach to the ilium, ischium, and pubis. So the synsacrum is unique to birds too. Take a look at the hind limbs. Like the forelimb, the hind limb's marked by a lot of fusion between bones, and so much so that you can't identify where the tibia ends and the tarsal elements begin. Hence, the fused bones there are called the tibiotarsus. Similarly, you can't tell where the tarsal and metatarsal elements begin and end, so the fused bone farther distally there is called the tarsometatarsus. Take a look at these, it's really cool. And that's pretty much, those are the highlights of what you'll get this week in the bone lab. And there's some cool specializations. Take a look at this. Here's a adaptation for a particular mode of life. Pretty easy to see sometimes when you look at a skeleton. Do you think eagles use their legs and feet for anything special? Look at that golden eagle. It's a killing machine. Okay, have fun in lab this week.